Okay, hi. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to see some familiar faces and names. Maybe see some new people too. And we're so glad that you were able to make the time to learn with us during the Ezra Tshuva. We know that it's a really busy holiday season, but we're looking forward to an excellent class. So the title of this class is avodah, Exertionary Prayer and Medieval Practice and Theory with Dr. Tayla Fishman. Just a few notes before we start. I have invited a bunch of you to join as panelists. That just means that we'll be able to see your faces, and when we pause for questions, you'll be able to unmute yourself. So I'm going to send invitations again right after I finish this introduction, and hopefully I'll get to see you after that. And of course, during the lecture section of this class, please stay muted, and you can put any questions that come up during that time in the chat here or on Facebook Live. In this session, we're going to look at challenges of prayer through the examination of primary source texts from Midrash, Ibn Ezra, Maimonides, Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, the Zohar, Eliezer Azikri, and Rabbi Simcha Bunem of Pryszucha. In the first lecture, we're going to explore the ways in which pre-modern Jewish thinkers framed the challenges posed by prayer. Three topics today are the problem of language, the problem of access to God, and the injunction to worshipers to exert their imaginations. And as a historian, Tayla Fishman studies developments in Jewish culture between the 9th and 18th centuries within their broader Christian and Muslim contexts. She teaches undergraduates and graduate students in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania and in Penn's program in Jewish Studies. Along with many articles, she is the author of Shaking the Pillars of Exile, Voice of a Fool, an early modern Jewish critique of rabbinic culture from Stanford, and Becoming the People of the Talmud, Oral Torah as Written Tradition in Medieval Jewish Cultures. She's a winner of the Jewish Book Council's Nachum M. Sarna Award for Jewish Scholarship. Her current study of a contemplative practice of material devotion, known to 13th and 14th century Catalan Jews and conversos, identifies its ideational supports in regional Jewish conceptions of matter and illuminates the fine line that distinguishes these notions from the prevailing Christian incarnationalist theology. And with that, I'll let you begin.
Thank you very much. I already have to revise some of the things that I wrote not that long ago, but it will become clear. Anyway, welcome to everybody. Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova. We may all have the sense that prayer, tefillah, the attempt of humans to communicate with God, requires effort. But my own awareness that pre-modern Jews had articulated and deployed different modes of exertion as they attempted to attain contact with the divine was first awakened by my study of a particular passage in Sefer Hasidim. I will consider this particular passage in the next lecture within this series, along with, Sefer Hasidim is a 12th century composition ascribed to Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid that was composed in the Rhineland in the 12th century. I'll be looking at that particular example along with the Catalan example that was referenced earlier. This is a practice of visual contemplation that seems to have been well known to Jews of Aragon and Catalonia in the Middle Ages. So that's for next week. But in this evening's remarks, I want to briefly reflect on the process by which Jews came to acknowledge prayer as a substitute for sacrifice and note the historical shift between trying to imitate temple practices to modes of exertion that were undertaken by the individual worshiper. There are two preliminary remarks. The first is that the perspective of Maimonides, the 12th century towering scholar of Sfarad, Rambam, will be noticeably absent from this evening's remarks. As some of you know, Rambam asserted unequivocally that God, who is, and I'll say it in the Hebrew translation from the Judeo-Arabic, Sechel, Maskil, Umuskal, that is, Maimonides, who is pure intellect, intellecting itself, that such a God does not hear our prayers and certainly does not change his mind in response to our appeals. That's why you're not going to hear about Rambam in this particular lecture series. But having said that, I will just add a personal note, and I do think, and this is not for the part of the historical record, but I do think that it is possible to make some elements of Maimonides' viewpoint relevant to the exertions of prayer today. That's a personal matter. Okay, the second preliminary remark that I want to make has to do with the title that I've given the series of talks. Avodah sheba'avodah means the labor that is in the labor. Okay, and it's a cutesy title in that it presupposes the Talmudic dictum which calls prayer avodah shebalev, the labor of the heart or the service of the heart. I chose this name to remind us at some level that the original forms of avodah that are described in Tanakh, in Chumash, namely the avodah of the Leviim, avodat Ohel Moed, and avodat HaKodesh, the service of the tent of meeting, and avodat HaKodesh, the service of the sanctum, right, of whether the Mishkan or the Mikdash subsequently, that these were actual physical labors. And there was undoubtedly a reason why Leviim were retired at 50 years of age, right? You know, when we think about the labor, I was trying to emphasize that nuance in the notion of prayer as well. In order to better appreciate the seismic mental shift that was required in accepting the idea that verbal prayer was a substitute for sacrifice, we should remember that with the exception of the 70 years of Galut Bavel, the Babylonian exile, first Israelites and later Jews had been connecting with divinity through the cult, the sacrificial cult, for more than a millennium, first in the Mishkan and then in the two temples. You can figure 1,240 years of sacrificial engagement with divinity if we date the Exodus from Egypt to 1240 before the Common Era, as Professor Nahum Sarna did. Shifting a way of thinking that had prevailed for so long, and particularly as Jews lived among other peoples who also sacrificed at temples to their own gods, it couldn't have been easy to shift away from that expectation that this was the appropriate mode for connecting. And it would hardly have taken place, this shift to recognize prayer, verbal prayer as a substitute for sacrifice could certainly not have been an immediate shift. For one thing, Jews who were in mourning after the Churban, after the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE, they expected that the temple would be rebuilt, just as had been the case when many Jews returned from Babylonia under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. And beyond that, prayer was something that Jews had been doing alongside of the sacrificial cult in the temple. We have evidence that there were in Egypt in the 3rd century before the Common Era, there were prayer houses, and certainly in Eretz Yisrael itself, we have evidence that there were synagogues, though it's not clear exactly what was going on there. So I just would like us to turn to the sources for a second. I've in section 1, from cultic labor to prayer, I've just included several, they're hardly an exhaustive list of sources that I think bear looking at. The first one that I've brought from Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 2. And bear in mind, this is the Mishnah that comes immediately after the essential foundational prologue describing how the Torah was transmitted by God to Moshe at Sinai and on down to Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, right? The men of the Great Assembly are understood to have been Jewish scholars of the Persian period, so we would say perhaps the 5th century before the Common Era, right? So that's the opening of Pirkei Avot, which is probably known to many people, and it affirms the unbroken continuity in the chain of tradition. Immediately after that, we have this statement, which is the first one, Pirkei Avot 1:2, and I'll read in Hebrew. Shimon HaTzadik haya mishyarei Knesset Hagdolah, right? Shimon HaTzadik was among the last of the members of the greatest men of the Great Assembly. Hu haya omer al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed, al ha'torah v'al ha'avodah v'al gemilut chasadim, right? He used to say, the world stands upon 3 things: the Torah, the temple service, and the acts and practice of acts of piety. Now, what I find remarkable about this is that the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, who chose to remember this saying of Shimon HaTzadik, that they are reaching back 8 centuries, right? From the 3rd century, let's say, right, Mishnah, to the 5th century before the Common Era. They're reaching back 8 centuries and finding this affirmation of the importance of the temple service as a pillar of the world. They're not willing to bypass that, even though the temple has been destroyed. And that's in the 3rd century if we are speaking of Tanaim of Eretz Yisrael. They're transmitting it and they want this record preserved. Okay, moving on to the next passage from the Babylonian Talmud, Brachot 26b. Itmar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina Amar Tfilot Avot Tiknun. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi Amar Tfilot Keneged Tmidim Tiknun. Okay, now we're jumping ahead in time because, of course, the Gemara is later than the Mishnah, and I'll read it in English, but then I will emphasize what I wanted us to notice here. It was stated, Rabbi Yosei, son of Chanina, and I've given you in italics, 2nd generation Eretz Yisrael Amorah, said, prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. Fine. And of course, once that's opened up, it means that Shacharit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv were instituted respectively by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who is earlier, right, he's the generation of transition from Tanaim to Amoraim, said, prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings. Okay, here we now find an expression that is beginning to link or striving to link the verbal prayers to the sacrifices which are no longer being given. Okay, that's an early attestation. The next passage that I have brought forward for you is a biblical passage from Hosea, and it's worth looking at it, I'm going to say out of context, because it will be invoked in the next reading. Okay, so this is all important. Kichu imachem devarim v'shuvu el Hashem. So one could say, take words with you and return to God. Imru elav kol tisa avon v'kach tov, right? Forgive all iniquity and accept that which is good. And here's the pregnant phrase, unashalma parim sifatenu. So will we render for bullocks the offering of our lips. That translation already, I think, gives a big crutch to lean on. So I'm jumping now to the next passage, which is from Psikta de Rav Kahana. This is a Midrashic compilation of the 5th and 6th centuries. And here is the, I guess it's the passage from the sages from Chazal, which makes the link between sacrifice and prayer, verbal prayer, explicit. Not just the link, but the substitution of verbal prayer for sacrifice explicit. So, Unashalma parim sfatenu, right? That comes from that verse in Hosea. Amar Rav Abahu, mi mishalem otam haparim shehayinu makrivim lefanecha. Said Rabbi Abahu, and I wrote 3rd generation Eretz Yisrael Amora, who actually pays, who actually renders those bullocks, I would say cows, right, that we used to sacrifice before you. Sfatenu, our lips do this, betfilah sha'anu mitpalalim lefanecha. Our lips do this with the prayer that we render in your presence. So this is the proof text par excellence. Now, I would hardly think, I mean, any student of post-Churban Judaism, post-Second Temple Judaism, or the first centuries of the Common Era, knows well that Jews were a very fractious lot in that community, and that there were multiple voices of different groups, sects, if you will, right? Katot, that were vying for the mantle of authority to call themselves, to define where Judaism was going. And historians of the period, and I'm actually not a specialist at all in this period, but all would say that the rabbis did not really garner the authority that we ascribe to them until maybe as late as the 6th century. Okay, so we have to, I'm willing to say 4th, just to, not be a total outlier in this debate, but the rabbis are struggling to put forward a platform that will make their version of Judaism viable following the trauma of losing the sacrificial cult. Okay, and then the last passage that I brought here is the one that's implicit or taken for granted, I should say, in the title of the series. Umenalan divitfila ditanya. This is really a question about how do we know that the prayer for rain is specifically mentioned in the Amida prayer. That's extraneous to the use that we're putting the phrase to this verse, this passage to. Ditanya la'ahava et Hashem Elokeichem ula'avdo b'chol levavchem. Right. So how do we know? And there's the verse from Shema, right? To love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart. Ezohi avodah shehi balev. Which is the kind, and since with all your heart, serve him with your heart. So which is the kind of labor or service which is done with the heart? Heve omer zot tefillah. You must say, this is prayer. Okay, so I think I've tried to make the historical point that this shift did not happen easily. Moving on to the next section of passages, and it's a short section, but maybe more to say about it. I want to note that it was very hard to divorce let's say that rabbis found it very difficult to divorce themselves from the temple cult, notwithstanding the fact that there was no temple, and as historians of the period would explain, there was probably a bit of rivalry, maybe more than a bit, between the rabbis as their powers waxed, and the Kohanim, who of course had no cultic locus, no place where they could ply their trade. On the other hand, they had been vouchsafed knowledge that had been transmitted father to son, and had held a leadership position for, as I've said, over a millennium. But so you might have thought that the rabbis would do something to distance themselves from the temple cult, which you could say they did by saying that Nishama Parim Sfatenu, we will render the words of our lips will be to you as if they were sacrifices. But you can see that the idea of mimicking that which had taken place in the temple remained strong, and remained strong enough that this coming week, those Jews who will be observing Yom Kippur will be, I'm going to say, co-performers in the ritual of the avodah service of Yom Kippur. So I did not include the text of the avodah service. Everyone is invited to read it, to think about it. It will appear in your machzor, and it's a recitation of the events of the day, focusing on the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and as recorded in Mishnah Yoma. So I regard this, and this is Fishman, it's not tradition. I would say that the avodah service may be the strongest example that practicing Jews know for exertion, an act of collective exertion. Because without the kahal, without the congregation, playing a part in this drama, which we reenact, this performance is an act of exertion. And I'm not only talking about bowing and lying prostrate during the Aleinu, or we'll leave it at that. I mean, I think that this is something that cannot happen without the collective, and a strong collective will to perform, to enable this ritual to be performed. And some would say that it's also a moment of great emotional charge that results from enacting this in concert. Okay. But a point that I want to make, which is why I brought in the very next passage, and I have to find it myself. It's a passage from Sikta Darav Kahana. Yes. Okay. But this is a different, right? The same Sikta Darav Kahana, the same compilation mentioned before. I brought this in because a point was made has been made by students of the Avodah service, Yosef Yahalom, Michael Swartz, who have studied the Avodah service as it was performed in the Middle Ages with many, many piyutim. And the point that is made is that the Avodah service was not only, and I think biblically it was, the supreme quest for atonement for Israel. But and here I'm kind of interpreting what they have said and adding a bit of historical nuance. Let me say it first, and then I'll give the historical nuance. We look at Psikta de Rav Kahana, 13:11, we read the following. Okay, and I'm going to go and skip to the fifth word. Eser masaot nas'a hashechina mikruv lekruv, mikruv lemiftan habayit, umimiftan habayit lakruvim, mikruvim l'sha'ar hakadmoni, misha'ar hakadmoni lachatzer, mechatzer lemizbeach, mimizbeach lagag, megag lachoma, mechoma le'ir, me'ir lahar hazeitim. Okay, this is, and I'll read it in English, and I do have a question that I can't answer. I think I needed to do more homework. Why two of these stages of the ascent of the divine presence, the Shekhinah, as the Shekhinah is leaving the now destroyed temple, it describes her ascent from one place to the next, getting farther and farther away from the place where worshipers could reach God's presence. Okay, it's a sad tale of the ascent of the divine presence, when in fact we human beings rely on the divine presence being lowered into our terrestrial world so that we can encounter it. That's the essence of prayer. So the Shekhinah traveled in 10 journeys from cherub to cherub, that you have to picture this on the sides of the kaporet. Sorry, I have to think about that. From the cherub to the threshold of the house, from the threshold of the house to the cherubim, that's where I didn't do my homework. From the cherubim to the eastern gate, from the eastern gate to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the courtyard altar, from the altar to the roof, from the roof to the wall to the city, from the city to the Mount of Olives, which is where the Geula will come from, the Mount of Olives, right? Mashiach, this is a very eschatologically potent locus. Given the understanding, and here's where I get historical, this is a very Neoplatonic concept, the notion that that divine presence is experienced more potently as it comes down into our terrestrial world is consistent with Neoplatonic schemata, let's say. I'm not saying it's Goyish. I'm saying that Neoplatonic ways of thinking permeated the civilizations of the Hellenistic world and were readily absorbed by them large, I would say to a great extent, not only because they were there and you took it for granted, but because there was a synergistic reaction with different types of theological thinking. So now I get to the point, which took me a long time to make, that the avodah service was not simply about attaining atonement for Israel. It was also about drawing the Shekhinah down again, getting the Shekhinah to come down, right? Again, the culmination or the most fraught moment of the avodah service is when the Kohen Gadol is by himself inside the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, and he pronounces the Shem HaMeforash, right? The Tetragrammaton, the name that is God's essence, and he's not killed, right? That, if there's not, you can't come up with any more potent presence of God than that. And so when in reenacting the avodah service, if we understand that this was, at least for the Paitanim, right, those who lived in Eretz Israel in the 7th to 9th centuries, or the 6th to 9th centuries, the classical period, that they were addressing the idea that we need to draw down the Shekhinah, the presence of God, which of course it is what facilitates prayer, because if God's too far away, you can't reach him. Okay, I threw in something that we're not going to read in its entirety. I just wanted to make this point, and something I'd like to think about more. And this is that very long passage from Saadia Gaon, which I didn't even attempt to translate for you. And I'm going to give you the crib notes, or the gist of why I brought it. It's a bit of an outlier to the arc of this talk, but Saadia Gaon, who lived between 882 and 942, he was originally from Egypt. He did become one of the Gaonim, but well, I'll leave it at that for now. He did battle with Karaites, the Jews who rejected rabbinic authority and claimed that there was no oral Torah. And in the introduction to his commentary on his Sidur, Saadia makes the point quite stridently that the Karaites are wrong in utilizing the language of Psalms in their prayers. And he has to engage in some fancy footwork in order to make this point cogently. And it's curious. According to Saadia, no, what he really hates about it, well, there are two things he hates about it. One is that he feels that modes of engaging God that took place in the temple are not to be, which is what Karaites did, that they should not be using these modes of engaging God, because of course the Leviim were those who recited the Psalms on the temple steps, or at least Shir HaMa'alot they did, but other Psalms as well. More specifically, he claims that the Psalms, though we ascribe them to David HaMelech, to King David, were actually given prophetically by God to King David. So they're really God's words. And then the argument that he makes, and you have the source, those of you who want to pursue it, he makes the argument that it is inappropriate for the servant to use the words of the master in addressing the master, right? Once you can, if you accept Saadia's claim that the words of Psalms really are God's words, then you may not use them when you're pouring your heart out to God. You can't use the words of the Adon when you are the Eved. Okay, it's very curious, and I think there's much more to be said about it, but I brought it in here because I wanted to at least show some element within Jewish tradition as it underwent change that was overtly opposed to utilizing temple practices in our prayer. Interestingly, of course, Saadia had to then justify all the different places in our own liturgy where we do use Psalms or the word of the master, right, from anything that God has spoken from the Tanakh. And he essentially draws a line between that it's okay to use the words of God in ritual settings, but not in liturgical settings. Now that's fancy footwork, right? The difference between, say, the reenacting of something, that's a ritual, and actually praying, pouring out your heart. There you must not use the words of the master. Okay, that's why I threw in this passage, as well as a little passage from the Karaite Al-Kirkisani, 10th century, contemporary with Saadia Gaon, who rebukes the rabbinites not only for their use of piyutim, which have no sacrality whatsoever, but also for their failure to bring in psalms in their prayers. Again, it's not totally true, but for Karaites, psalms were the only prayers. Okay, moving on. We are now in the third section. Okay, this section, here I'm now identifying a mode of exertion that was not only sanctioned, but promoted by some Jewish thinkers of the Middle Ages. And I brought Midrash Tanhuma, which is a late Midrash, so we could consider it a medieval, it's a medieval compilation. I chose this passage because this passage refers to God as sometimes being elusive, and that God hides sometimes, and that sometimes he needs to be sought. So again, for time reasons, I think I'm going to not read through Midrash Tanhuma. You have it in English, right? I'm not going to read it. If we have time, we can come back to it, but it's there to put on the map the idea that Jews were talking about the fact that God sometimes wants to be found, sometimes doesn't want to be found, right? The inconsistent that humans who pray sometimes strike out because they can't find God, and that God has a role in this. Okay, I'm moving on now to Shir HaKavod, a hymn that would be known to many people who daven in Orthodox synagogues. It's the last prayer following Musaf on Shabbat, and it is often sung by pre-bar mitzvah aged boys in Orthodox synagogues. So I did not bring all of this, but I want to comment on it. And it's an absolutely remarkable prayer. It's ascribed to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. And I brought the first few lines in order to say a few things about them. So Anim Zmirot, I know it sounds so weird not to be singing it, and my Sephardi pronunciation throws you off, but Anim Zmirot v'shirim e'erog ki elecha nafshi ta'arog. So I shall make pleasant songs and weave verses, because for you my soul longs. Okay, cause and effect. Why am I, and by the way, the Zmirot actually shouldn't be songs. Zmirot are prayers, okay? I mean, we say Zmir, we sing Zmiris, but on Shabbat afternoon or Shabbat, Leil Shabbat, but I'm making prayers and weaving verses, okay? Because why am I doing this? The longing for you is what is driving me to do this. And I guess I want to do a sidebar that I didn't do just before. I want to say something about the role of longing and yearning. It's fairly clear to people who look at mystical expressions of Jewish mysticism, or just look at Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, that the real, which of course is a central text in Jewish mysticism insofar as the lover and the beloved are understood to represent God and Knesset Yisrael, the congregation of Israel. But at the heart of mystical expressions is the sentiment of yearning and longing. It's all about the chase. It's not about the consummation, right? If the consummation, there's nothing to tell, right? It's the longing that drives the impulse to keep seeking and searching. And so this dynamic animates Anim Zmirot, it animates Yedid Nefesh, which many people may know, a hymn that's sung on Leil on Erev Shabbat, before Kabbalat Shabbat. But the point is, longing is the most potent force in the quest to engage God, or more directly, etc. All right, so first he says, right, it's because I long for you that I'm praying and writing these verses. I want to know your deepest mysteries. That's line 2. And then there's a cycle here. It's kind of cyclical. But when I speak of your, and I'll come back to glory, when I speak of your glory, my heart yearns for your love. So the more I talk about you, the more I long for you. And then the last verse that I've picked, Asaprak votcha v'lo re'iticha, adamcha achancha v'lo yidaticha, right? I will recount your glory, though I have not seen you. I describe you, though I have not known you. Okay, so the language that is being used, and that's why I say that Anin Zmirot is such an amazing passage, is that it directly invokes the fact that Torah refers to God looking different ways. Of course, the imaging of God as a young man with curly black hair is only if one interprets Shir HaShirim, the male figure in Shir HaShirim as God. Okay, if you don't take it at any figurative level, then but it's presumed that one takes it at that level. Again, this is why it was brought into the canon of Tanakh. So these evocations of the images of God and are spelled out in minute detail, right? The curly hair, the red cheeks, et cetera, and this conforms to a mode of poetic expression, and I would say artistic expression, that is called ekphrasis. Sorry, it's a Greek word, ekphrasis. Ekphrasis was an art cultivated in antiquity and into the Middle Ages. Romans excelled at it, and it consisted of using words that were so evocative that someone listening could actually see the image in front of them. So this is a very ekphrastic hymn, Shir HaKavod, that invites us, or sees no problem, let's say, invites worshipers to indulge imaginations in imaging God, at least within the bounds of what the Torah or the interpreted Torah permit. Okay, I'm going to jump to the last, I'm going to skip the Zohar for a second. We'll come back to that. Was Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, if he wrote Shir HaKavod, was he being a mystic in this case? Something to be discussed. Okay, I've kind of bracketed what the kavod is, and that's all important. I will say this, that the kavod, which is under kavod Hashem, right? Or if you look throughout the Chumash, you will find that the kavod is a manifestation of God, and it's the way in which humans can engage God through this manifestation. And this becomes all important in the Middle Ages. It intertwines with theories of prophecy that are developed, particularly in the Islamicate world, as Muslims are very interested in prophets as well. So anything having to do with images and how God mediates God's self so that God's self can be perceived can really form around the notion of kavod. Okay, I want to jump to Simcha Bunem of Pryszucha, even though he's very late, but of course he's still pre-modern as a chassid. And this is his comment on Genesis 1:26. Vayomer na'aseh adam b'tzalmenu v'gomer. right? And he said, let us make man in our image, etc. Ki Adam migzerat adameh, because the word Adam comes from or is from the same root as the word adameh, I will liken, right? Demut, image, I will, right? Achar shena'asa hakol mefo'ar u'muhudar, Ratzah Hashem laharot ma'asav sheyireh hakol mikol ma'asav. So after everything was completed beautifully and wondrously, God wanted to show off his deeds, that all would see his deeds. V'hametziut levad adam lo yasig ki im kol echad et atzmo. But reality, with the exception of humankind, the existence, those things which exist and that were created, can never grasp anything other than their own selves. Lachein bara Hashem et ha'adam, for this reason God created man, shehu koach kalul mi elyonim v'tachtonim. For this reason God created man, who is a composite of the upper and the lower, the celestial and the terrestrial. Asher yuchal l'damot hakol benafsho, right? Man who has both the upper and the lower is able to imagine anything in his soul. Right? This is a very positive shout out to the imagination. V'zehu mahut ha'adam shir'eh v'yavin, I think it's supposed to say v'yavin, v'yadameh lo zulato. And this is the essence of men who can see and understand and liken or image, project, create images, produce images, but none other than man can do this. And this is why it said, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu kechaf hadimyon, right? In accord, this is why it said, let us make man kidmutenu, right? In the same way that the heavenly powers or God can image anything, so too can man through his kaf hadimyon, through his powers of imagination. Ki lo yisha'er ela hadomeh k'tzat v'domeh, because the only way that a person can kind of estimate, the only way that any being can estimate something else is if he has something in common with it. Okay, so there we see a real shout out to the power of imagination. And the last thing I'm going to read is the passage from the Zohar, and I did not, the passage that came immediately before that, I should have read aloud with you before we read Simcha Bunem of Pryszucha. It's from Proverbs 31:23, right? And it says, it's the passage in Eshet Chayil, right? In Proverbs 31, a woman of valor. And the verse is Noda b'sha'arim ba'ala b'shivto im ziknei aretz, right? Her husband is known in the gates, right? That's the opening to the city when he sits among the elders of the land. Okay, so it's the key word here is sha'ar, and here's the Zohar. Okay, we have Ela vadai noda b'sha'arim ba'ala da kucha brichu. Right? Of course, her husband is known in the gates. This is the blessed one, the blessed one, blessed holy one. De'ihu ityadav itdabek lefum ma dimisha'er belibe kol chad kama diyachil li'idabka berucha dechachmeta. Right? The blessed one, the blessed holy one, who is known and grasped to the degree that each one imagines / estimates, right, misha'er, according to the capacity to attain the spirit of wisdom. Lefum ma de misha'er belibe, hachi ityada belibe. And as one fathoms in the mind, so he, God, is known in the world. Okay. what we've seen in the last three passages are, as I said, a full-throated encouragement of the Jew to use imagination. That's an act of will, right? That's an exertionary act in order to be able to bring God into one's life. That's not forbidden, and of course they don't. It's not restricted here either by Simcha Bunem of Pryszucha or by the Baal HaZohar. Neither one of them says it can only be those images which were mentioned in Tanakh. Okay, I'm going to sign off with my remarks simply by saying that I don't expect, speaking for myself, these particular examples that show Jews actively trying to figure out how you feel the presence of God more directly so you can communicate in prayer. I don't necessarily think that they speak to us as we seek our own, and this is more of a vort than actually a lesson or a lecture, but I don't think they speak to us in their modes of the modes that they developed for themselves. But I do think that they show us that it's been important in every, in all periods for Jews to labor at prayer. And I should certainly mention, which I forgot to do at the beginning, that, the teachings of the sages of Chazal are filled with conversations about kavanah, right? Kavanah meaning intent, the intent that must accompany prayer or that makes prayer effective, right? And there are a variety of opinions about this. I think something that I would want to ask just as, as a lone person is whether the idea of kavanah means that you have to really be intending the words that you're reading, which presupposes understanding, which not every praying Jew has of the Hebrew language, or whether it speaks to something that is kavanah can also encompass the wordless impulses that we bring to our prayers. Thank you. I've spoken too long. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Yeah, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. No, I just want to say in general, I'm going to make a very general comment. I often go to a Reconstructionist shul. Not always. Sometimes I go to open Orthodox ones, but the rabbi there has said quite a few times, very few of us in this room believe in a traditional concept of God. And yet, for the high holidays, they use a Reconstructionist machzor that has musaf. It's very difficult for a Reconstructionist to do musaf. But I feel, to use an old-fashioned word, almost like a sense of kedusha from some of the people, like some of the people bowing on the floor. And so I'm just saying it's hard to separate. People are complex. They can have two different beliefs or different feelings at the same time. On the other hand, I'm going a bit to the Ohel, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and very different atmosphere, to put it mildly. But sometimes it feels, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish, but it seems almost like sometimes I get confused where I am, because some of the people at the Reconstructionist shul, I feel like the same attitude as some of the people at Lubavitch. It's hard to make the strict binary, moderns versus
100%.
Yeah, people are complex.
Right.
Yeah.
I think all humans have a capacity. This is just Fishman. This is, it's not my training that it entitles me to say what I'm about to say. It's just a personal reaction. I think all humans have the capacity to feel the awe of God's presence. And I think that collective performance can really enhance that opportunity. but it's a muscle that needs to be developed. But I like what you've said very much. It's, no group has a monopoly on this, and there's a living truth to it that keeps people doing it.
I say this as someone, when I was a kid, I used to do often Shir HaKavod at the end of the service, and there was always controversy about it, about saying it. Some people didn't feel it was appropriate, but it was, I always thought it was beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or I'm just looking at the Facebook and there doesn't seem to be anything there. Okay. Well, I think that, we have plenty to digest, and of course, you have the sources, so can, think about those again as we head into Yom Kippur very soon. I think, that, it's a long day of prayer. There's a lot of, it can be, there are sections of it that really kind of move you along, and there are sections that, you have to kind of work to crack open. But I think that, this gives us kind of multiple perspectives and, perhaps ways of doing that. Thank you so much, Dr. Fishman, and thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for being part of our learning community. So more things that are happening at Drisha. This Sunday, we're going to have 2 classes. At 10 a.m., Rabbi Silber will be speaking about the avodah of Yom Kippur. And at 1 p.m., we're very excited to have Miss Rachel Sharansky-Danziger to deliver the Stanley Rudolph Memorial Lecture, which this year will focus on the role of parents and children in the High Holiday Liturgy. All 6 episodes of this season's Music and Liturgy project are available for your listening and devotional pleasure on Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, and in other places too. You can learn more about all of this at elul.drisha.org. And on behalf of everyone at Drisha, we wish you a Gemar Chatima Tova, and look forward to seeing you back here next week.